Way, I picked her up there and I choked her, but I didn't kill her. I think that was the very first one I choked. I never killed her.
Somehow she survives the attack and narrowly escapes with her life, but so many who come after her won't be quite as lucky. It's the summer of 1982, and the Pacific Avenue South Strip, located near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, is alive with teenage girls and young women seeking paying dates.
I was paying for sex. We agreed on sex. Sometimes I'd kill them, and sometimes I wouldn't. I had a lot of rage at that time, and that's why I killed these women.
It's quite monumental because the missing juvenile problem is that nobody gives, especially nobody gives a darn about runaway juveniles.
The street workers, all but forgotten, remain trapped in a vicious cycle, and the lifestyle is an exceptionally dangerous one.
As you correctly pointed out, we're dealing with a class of victims who are hard to trace and hard to investigate, who disappear without being reported, whose movements are hard to trace, whose friends are difficult to run down.
Then the work suddenly becomes even more perilous. First, one body is located, then another. Within just a month, the body count has reached 5. These girls and women of the night are disappearing at a frequency that is increasingly alarming.
How did you kill her?
Choked her.
With what?
My arm. I would be on top of her, usually face to face. If I couldn't have a climax, I would have her turn around and I would get her from the back end. Sometimes I'd kill them, and sometimes I wouldn't. I had a lot of rage at that time, and that's why I killed these women. I didn't plan on killing them.
A couple of years pass, and the number of missing and murdered women climbs to well over 40.
There's, like I said, there's upwards of up to 63 people I killed, so they kind of run together sometimes. And I didn't make a list in my mind which ones I killed with a rope, which I killed with my arms.
The sheer number of victims gives insight into how the killer saw the victims as easily dispensable. In his mind, they were objects to be used for his pleasure and nothing more.
You think it's possible that this guy could stop?
No, well, unless he got, unless he was born again and got filled with the Holy Spirit.
But I believe God's forgives you from your sins.
You think he's forgiven you now?
I think he has.
In a very real way, this guy's figured it out by now.
Oh, I know.
He's figured it out.
He's way ahead of us. I mean, he's so far ahead of us, it's unreal.
It would be nearly 2 harrowing decades before the monster is finally identified. The first victim was recovered on July 15th of 1982. A gruesome discovery. 2 teenage boys had spotted her body floating in Washington State's Green River. Wendy Cofield was just 16 years old when she was killed. She disappeared a week earlier. It was later found that she'd been strangled with an item of her own clothing.
The first one I killed?
Yes.
I don't actually remember where I killed them because I wasn't planning on killing any of them.
It's possible that the killer didn't decide in advance that he was going to kill. It's possible he acted in the moment. It should be noted that impulsivity is a sign of antisocial personality disorder. However, committing murder is likely something that he fantasized about, so the idea was likely something he'd been considering before actually committing the crime. At this point, Wendy's death appeared to be an isolated event. Everyone hoped that was the case, but it would soon prove to be the beginning of a murderous rampage like no other. Then, another body. Deborah Bonner, age 23, was located just a few weeks later. Within a month, the body count quickly climbed to 5, with the discovery of a Marcia Chapman, age 31, Cynthia Hines, age 17, and Opal Mills, just 16 years old, all found at the same Green River dump site.
Maybe I better tell you something about the dump sites. The most prevalent that we had right off the bat was the 5 right in the river.
Mm-hmm. And he dumped them in there for a reason. He dumped them in there. He dumped Coalfield and company in there because he didn't think they'd be found. He must have had some reason for believing that.
The beautiful area that had once provided a heavenly ambiance had quickly transformed into hell on earth.
Why don't you tell us what you can remember about
Number 4, I think, was Hines.
Okay.
She was the one that was in the river. I don't actually remember where I killed her. After I first I had with her and killed her.
Said he was returning to the dump
He
site.
does. He's returning to his dump sites, not just to bring bodies back, but probably in the interim. That he's returning, if if only to drive by, he's returning to check those dump sites out after he's dumped the body there. I can almost guarantee it.
How about after we found him?
No, we wouldn't touch it with a 10-mile pole.
He was partially correct in his speculation. The killer was revisiting the scenes. As for the Green River Killer's victim, he would later return to her body after work.
Drove down the same way to where the body was, and I drove down further, parked on the side of the road, looked both ways, nobody was watching, and I ran down the hill towards where the trail was, pulled off any clothes that she might have had, had sex with her, right there in the spot, put my pants back on, drug her down into the river, got in the river, pushed her down and put one or two rocks on top of her.
Gary, what's the longest time that it's been after you killed one of these girls that you came back and...
2 or 3 days. Until there was a smell or maggots.
The killer may have experienced gratification by reliving the recent murder during his deplorable act, known as necrophilia.
Your arms were floating?
Her arms were not flooring, but they were probably moving.
Was she waving at you?
I might just be getting that from the discovery. No, I don't. She wasn't waving at me. No, just waving with any kind of current coming by.
So then you put Heinz in the river?
Put Heinz in the river.
Cynthia was the final victim discarded in the Green River, but she wasn't the last of his victims, not even close. The following month, the body count reached 6 with the finding of Giselle Lovern on September 25, 1982. At just 17 years of age, Giselle could have had a bright future ahead of her. She was exceptionally intelligent and was on her way out of working the streets. She'd planned to call it quits after one more week. She just needed enough money to fund her trip home to California.
You found these first five really quickly. You can see he changes. He's obviously not going to use that Green River anymore, at least not for a while. And he's looking for something that's more effective, so he goes back to dry land with number 6. And Lovern is found in September, but still he sticks to these sites.
It seems the killer found a better way to conceal the discarded bodies following his atrocities at the Green River.
Between September of 82 and May of 83, he didn't find anybody. So in his mind, he was effective.
Let's say he's continuing to kill. Okay. Still in the Seattle area.
Mm-hmm.
And we found these locations out here. What would his next step be?
That was the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there was just no way to accurately predict the answer. With the passing months came more strangled bodies. By the end of 1982, somewhere around 15 murders had occurred, though only a fraction of the remains of the victims had been located at the time. One of the youngest victims, estimated to be his 15th kill, was Colleen Brockman. She was only 15 years old when she disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1982. And like the others, her story is heart-wrenching. It's said she told a friend that her home life in North Seattle, where she lived with her father and brother, was miserable. However, she didn't elaborate further. Colleen had run away a few times previously, but she always returned home. This time would be much different.
I'm quite sure that was one in Seattle on Christmas, and it was cold, but she needed the money.
Colleen climbed into a truck, having no idea she had just minutes to live.
I walked her in to a creek there in Tobina. I walked her in some 20 feet, put her on the bank side towards the road. I don't think I went back and I think I had all of her clothes, but I remember I walked her upstream.
Walked her or drug her?
Drug her up. Feet first, I think it was feet first or hands first. I don't know, but it was upstream, uphill, next to the stream in the road. If her hands were over her head, I put her that way. If her feet were there, her hands behind her, and left her there.
Describe her. Race, Height, weight, age?
She's, I'd say, 14 to 16, maybe at the most 18. Light color hair, the puffiness of her cheeks, the
Baby fat.
baby fat.
But this photograph looks like this girl has something on her teeth. Does that look familiar?
To the braces in.
Colleen's remains weren't located until 18 months after her disappearance. Sadly, it was the braces on her teeth that helped identify the teenage girl. As the months rolled by and the bodies continued to accumulate, the girls and women working the streets lived in fear, always looking over their shoulders. The speculation on the part of law enforcement was endless. Detectives found the level of frustration hard to bear as they raced to identify the assailant. The efforts always proved futile. They were further demoralized each time another body or set of remains was located. The horrifying spree raged on. At its height in 1983, as many as 5 more women would disappear in as short as a month's time. It's estimated that the Green River Killer had already killed approximately 20 of his victims by April of 1983. All the while, law enforcement was absolutely baffled, with no idea on how to stop him, never mind uncover his identity.
What do you think's motivating the desire to kill? In some way, who knows? I mean, in the detailed recesses of his mind, how this particular behavior pattern evolved. There are an infinite number of ways to explain how a man can come to the point where he destroys human life as this person has. He's killing because he wants to kill.
That was just downright killing. I wasn't there to rape her.
On the night of April 30th, 1983, 18-year-old Marie Mulvar was working as a prostitute when she climbed into a truck. Her boyfriend often trailed behind in an attempt to keep her safe, but on this night, he soon lost sight of the vehicle at a traffic signal and wasn't able to find the truck Marie got into. Sadly, Marie would never be seen alive again.
Do you think there's something that we can do to draw him out of the woodwork?
Yes. I think there are a couple of things, and this may sound a little bit strange, but I'll offer them to you for what they're worth. There are a couple of things that I would say, with what I know here, you find a fresh body. I put that site under surveillance. I wouldn't move in. Now, that sounds a little bit odd to you. I would move in, secure the area, and try to keep everything off, the radios, right? But set up a surveillance network on that area. Now, you might want to move the body under cover of darkness, because let's face it, by the time, if your man comes back to that site, by the time he gets on top of that body, you've already, to the point where the body was, you've already got his number, and you're already going to be in on it. The best chance you have of catching this guy red-handed is to get a site with a fresh body and stick it out.
Bundy may have felt that he was in a position of authority or even superior to the police, since they'd requested his assistance with the case. This experience was likely a huge boost to his ego. Even so, the theory seemed to make sense, as it's not uncommon for a serial killer to return to the scene of the crime or to the place where they left their victim. Unfortunately, law enforcement was never able to pull it off. How was this monster able to convince each victim that he was harmless, that the transaction was a safe one to engage in?
Look, my initial impressions was this guy is young, he's, more or less in the same socioeconomic kind of strata that these young women can be associated with, lower middle class, let's say, that he's between 20 and 30, probably closer to 20. He's young, a low-paying job that restricts his movement. He doesn't have a lot of money, he can't move around. My gut reaction is these girls are being approached by somebody who really puts them at ease.
It was true. Police would eventually learn that the killer did have an unassuming appearance. He was fairly young and clean-cut, yet unremarkable. One of the few victims who survived his attack described him as boring and dull, in fact. The serial killer consultant contributed an idea to the detective.
Have you ever sat down and asked these girls, what kind of person do you think the Green River guy is? What does he look like? How old is he? And I'll bet you the guy would turn out to be old, or maybe wearing a business suit, or maybe, with maybe unshaven. But I bet you the last person they would expect to be the killer would be one of their own peers.
Bundy was most likely spot on, relating to the street worker's assumption of the killer's appearance. Maybe it was the age-old case of a wolf in sheep's clothing. It was no surprise that Bundy was also quite intrigued by the killer's morbid work.
In terms of when your victims disappeared, when they were found, where they were found, it's kind of fascinating watching some of this unfold. But this guy is learning. He's trying to find the best way to dispose of his bodies he can think of.
Bundy may have even been envious of the mysterious Green River Killer because he hadn't been caught yet. Maybe it's possible, though, that Bundy and those close to the case overestimated the Green River Killer's abilities. Areas of vast wilderness were at his disposal, after all, nearly in his own backyard. He took advantage of his surroundings, and it worked in his favor. And as the investigation continued, the killer tailored his methods as he saw fit.
That's when I started burying them. And when I started taking them out where I wouldn't go back.
You had an urge to go back and have
As I went back, I did have an urge, but I didn't do it.
The killer's attention to detail, however, was questionable. When he approached a teenage girl or woman, appearance wasn't much of a deciding factor.
She could have had a mustache, I probably wouldn't have known. I can't remember the faces because after I killed them, I couldn't look at them anymore.
He may have avoided looking at the faces of the victims in an attempt to dehumanize them. If he didn't see them as real people, maybe the killings were easier to commit. It seems they were all crimes of opportunity. Each victim had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time. The killer also had a conveniently selective memory. He was able to recall minute, insignificant details while failing to remember those of importance.
Amazing you remember the junk better than you do the...
You'd say yes.
You know?
It's clear that the killer viewed his victims as unimportant and insignificant. He didn't see them as people. The only thing he cared about was fulfilling his own desires. Through the course of interviews conducted over the killer's eventual arrest, detectives were finally able to get answers to some of the burning questions that had gone unanswered for so many years as they tried to make sense of how he remained at large for so long.
When the crime scene tape was up, did you ever drive by or see the area where they recovered her?
No, I stayed away from those areas. I just didn't want to be, because I've heard sometimes they film people to come in and film everybody like they did with these sites, because guys like to come back to see where they kill people and they're in the audience. I've heard that.
Through the interviews also came the revelation of another sadistic ritual the ruthless killer took pleasure in. As if taking their lives wasn't enough, he also took from the victims the few things they had.
There's no evidence of clothing, there's no jewelry.
Why is he doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Keep a minimum amount of evidence. No fibers, no hairs. Doesn't want. He may have a thing for clothes, but more likely, this guy doesn't want to be caught. Leaving a victim nude is the best way to leave the least amount of evidence.
True, but that wasn't the only motivating factor behind leaving the victims bare. The Green River Killer was the epitome of cold and calculating, as you'll see.
Did you take anything from this particular victim, take her clothing or anything?
Every one of them almost I took the clothing because I'm not to wear it or anything like that. It's just because maybe the hatred of the women that I like to have with no clothes on.
He loathed the women so much that he believed they didn't even deserve their clothes. Maybe this was his effort to inflict even more punishment upon them after their deaths.
Fine, for whatever reason, however he got to this point of killing prostitutes, it may have been a deliberate determination on his part that these were easy prey. It may be that he had something specifically against teenage prostitutes.
What would you then do with the clothing?
Usually I would either throw it away or if I was throw it out the car when I was driving or the truck.
And then there was also the jewelry.
Jewelry I put in 3 or 4 different places.
Why did you take the jewelry from the victims in the first place? What prompted you to take the necklace off or the ring off?
All this time I've never really thought of why I did it. Maybe it was to hurt the victims or something, the woman I killed.
Basically, they die,
They die, I take the
and
jewelry.
then you strip them right away of their jewelry?
Yeah.
And what was the point of that?
just to take it off and put it in my pocket. There's no, I did with almost every one of the bodies.
Like removing earrings off a dead person. Isn't that kind of weird?
It's probably kind of weird to you, but in my state of mind, it was their possessions, and now it's mine, and that's it.
If you had a ring that was really hard to get off.
I never had a ring that was real hard to get off.
And what would he do with the jewelry he stole from the victims?
Just get rid of it, throw it into the bathroom, or leave it at the airport, or it's not.
That doesn't make any sense to me. You think the police are going to think it's just a bad robbery? Taking jewelry?
Well, it'd be a combination. Maybe it's my trademark.
At times, he'd bring the jewelry to work and secretly toss the pieces into the women's restroom, knowing they'd be found. It likely thrilled him that there was a secret that only he was in on. He may have felt superior because he knew the truth, but no one else did. In actuality, it all came down to the fact that he didn't care who ended up with the jewelry.
Why do you even go to the trouble taking it to work? To the employees trying to give them away or illegal places?
Even though they...
Why wouldn't you just throw them out the window with the clothes?
Because I wanted them to go to somebody that was not a harm.
The killer's hatred toward his victims was so extreme, killing them still fell short of satisfying his sinister urges. In the years that followed 1983, the frequency of the killings had slowed considerably. Nearly 2 decades after the rampage began in 2001, everything caught up with the Green River Killer. The identity of the ruthless killer, one who had evaded police capture for so long, was shocking. He was a 52-year-old truck painter at a commercial manufacturing plant. His name was Gary Ridgway, and that was just the beginning. Over the years, the authorities had this ruthless killer in their sights, almost stopping his murderous rampage, and yet each time he slipped through their fingers to deadly consequences. A brief glimpse into how his deranged world began may help to shed light on the trajectory that landed him in this very seat. There were blatant warning signs well before the violence escalated to murder. In retrospect, 2 distinct sets of circumstances seem to have contributed to Gary's evolution to evil. For one, it's believed that his domineering mother behaved inappropriately toward him during his early adolescence. Gary admittedly harbored inappropriate feelings toward her, and his father harbored a distinct hatred toward prostitutes. He openly voiced his resentment of street workers around his family members. Gary bought into this same sentiment and took that animosity to a whole new level. By his teenage years, Gary had developed an innate desire to torture and kill. The first known fatality at Gary's hands was a family cat. This early warning sign indicates that he felt a lack of empathy for another living thing, which is one of the most well-known signs of psychopathy. Gary's violent acts escalated over time, though the victim that followed the cat was still no match for him. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods, where he stabbed the child in the abdomen. Miraculously, the child survived. During this time, Gary wasn't performing well in school, and his IQ was estimated to sit somewhere in the low 80s. Not far into adulthood, Gary had immersed himself in the world of adult entertainment workers. Even the contraction of gonorrhea didn't faze him. Interestingly, promiscuity is often a sign of psychopathy. Psychopaths tend to get bored easily, so they may frequently seek out new partners. Through all of his killing years, Gary was able to balance a job, 3 consecutive marriages, and 1 child. The life he led didn't seem consistent with one that a serial killer would lead, and maybe this contributed to his ability to go undetected. He was able to blend in, and though psychopaths do not experience feelings the same way that other people do, they are able to mimic emotions. This helps them manipulate those around them, and it's clear Gary did just that.
When he's doing all this, he can't be conducting normal relationships with people. His whole life is upset. He might find it hard to hold a job, hard to get in relationships with other people.
Yet Gary fooled everyone around him through all the many years of his killings. What follows is an interview he gave after his arrest, where he begins to shed light on how he was able to go undetected for so long.
That day, I went to work like normal. I don't know if it was overtime or not. About 9 o'clock, I was called into the office. I was brought into the office by the plant manager.
Don't let his soft-spoken demeanor fool you. This coward agreed to provide information in order to avoid the very fate that his victims never had a say in: a death sentence.
Well, Gary, what we tried to do based on the content of the proffer and the agreement was we'd like to start with is the bodies that are still out there. Every day that goes by, there's a chance that a house can be built on one.
10 to 14 bodies out there that we are unaware of, we have not found. So,
Possibly the most frustrating element of this case is the fact that Gary didn't go completely unnoticed over all those killing years. Encounters with law enforcement became commonplace. In actuality, it wasn't long before he'd landed himself at the top of the potential suspects list. Unfortunately, the evidence to build a case against him had not yet been uncovered, and he continually managed to evade charges. Consequently, more lives were lost. One of Gary's earliest run-ins with law enforcement came about after that catastrophic night that Marie Malvar climbed into his infamous truck, never to be seen again. Though her boyfriend lost track of the vehicle, he was able to locate a truck that closely resembled the one Marie had entered.
What were you driving at the time? A 1975 Dodge pickup with maroon and armored.
It will come as no surprise that the truck found by Marie's boyfriend happened to be parked in Gary's driveway.
Melbar, it was pretty close to the house. It was only 5 miles away or so.
When did the Des Moines detective come to your house
They came
in relation to Marie Malvar?
I guess I was on strike then, and they came the next day or something.
The next day?
Yeah. And they walked right to the house and didn't look, looked around and didn't see anything.
By the time the detective arrived, Marie was long gone. Her remains would not be located until 20 years after her disappearance. Another documented encounter with law enforcement came in 1984. By this time, Gary had made it high on the list of potential suspects. They were privy to his frequent transactions with prostitutes. There was suspicion that he could be the very monster they were looking for, disguised in a mask of mediocrity. However, it came down to the fact that there just wasn't direct evidence to tie him to any of the murders. At least, not yet. He agreed to a polygraph, and the test was administered on May 7th. Upwards of 40 victims had fallen prey to Gary by this time. Approximately half of the deceased had been recovered. And somehow, he passed. No deception was detected. How could this be? Given that polygraphs are notoriously unreliable, however, perhaps Gary had simply figured out how to beat the system.
But maybe the polygraph was too general. I don't know. Maybe he was just something wrong with his mind. There's obviously something wrong with his mind.
what'd you think? What were you doing? What was going through your mind?
Excuse me, I don't know. I didn't. I just was going to take it and thought for sure pass it.
You thought for sure you'd pass it?
Yeah. And I didn't, I don't think what the questions weren't maybe precise enough to, I don't remember what questions were.
He believed he'd pass for good reason. He'd already managed to get away with so many murders. He may have believed he was too smart to get caught. During the course of one of his many meetings, Gary provided officials with a saliva sample in 1987. Of course, at the time, forensic testing was not yet advanced enough to match saliva with other biological materials from the same individual. The sample was stored along with those obtained from victims until they could be tested without fear of losing the small amounts of evidence they'd managed to preserve over many years. Though few and far between, there were also stories of survival. A few women survived their brushes with death at the hands of the Green River Killer.
Tell me a little bit about the one that got away.
She was a black lady, little heavy set, 5'10", bigger than what I could handle. We walked back to the truck and I apologized to her, and she took her to where I needed to drop her off, and dropped her off. She got her money, and she probably used to men beating her up or something, but it didn't. She didn't turn me in, I don't think so.
Sadly, Gary was likely right, considering the dangers in her line of work. Another woman, on the other hand, did go to the police, but not right away. It was over 2 years before she summoned up the courage to contact law enforcement. Rebecca Garday went to the police in December of 1984. She told of the attack that occurred in November of 1982. Gary recalled the assault having been prior to the murder of his first victim that previous July. As he explained previously, the details began to run together. If she'd been attacked in November, then more than 10 victims had already been murdered. As a result of Rebecca having provided information to police, Gary was interviewed a couple months later, in February of 1985. He placed all the blame on Rebecca for the failed encounter.
She bit me and I choked her. And I let her go. Say she bit you. What did you do then? I pulled it out of her mouth and choked her.
How did you choke her?
In the back.
In the back?
Yeah.
You got your hands? You put her in a headlock or?
My arm.
Your arm. Why did you decide to choke her?
Because she bit me.
Why? You say you choked her for about 15 seconds.
20 seconds, I don't know.
You say you dated a lot of girls. Has this happened with any others?
No, it hasn't.
But you may have no other incidents with no other girls except this one particular one that we're talking about that you choked. Yes. What would have happened if she died?
Well, I don't think
her out.
I don't think she would have.
Do you know anything about chokeholds?
No.
Gary likely blamed Rebecca in an attempt to justify his actions to police.
She bit me, that's why.
He knew that it's his word against hers, despite the fact that his story didn't make sense. And then came the conclusion reached by the detective.
Gary told me that he hoped that nothing would become of this. However, if it did, that he could understand and it might teach him a lesson to where he would never go out and hire girls again. I recommend that this case be placed in the closed file. We have identified our suspect in the Gardy assault case. Rebecca does not wish to prosecute for the assault. I think her intention was just to identify a possible Green River suspect. Gary should maybe be looked at a little closer, possibly relating to other assaults.
And just like that, Gary had managed to evade law enforcement once again. But eventually, Gary Ridgway was finally caught. The ruthless killer's spree was finally brought to an end, thanks to a forensic technique known as short tandem repeat and the saliva sample obtained in 1987. A genetic profile of the strangler was produced, and he was quickly linked to 4 victims, and that number would grow considerably with time. In December of 2003, Gary was sentenced to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole. In 2011, yet another life sentence was added to the 48 he'd already received as he pleaded guilty to the 1982 killing of Rebecca Marrero. The actual count of vulnerable teenage girls and women who fell prey to Gary's diabolical undertaking has been projected at somewhere around 80 to 90 victims. Gary is amongst the most prolific American serial killers on record. To this day, there are still sets of unidentified remains and families whose questions have yet to be answered. It's likely that more murders will be linked to Gary as he sits in his jail cell.